Alright, we're going to go straight into 2 Samuel chapter 6. Just pick up where we kind of left off. It's a pretty interesting story, and if you've read it, you kind of know the outcome. If you haven't, then you might be a little bit surprised. But before we get started, we'll talk a little bit about our American flag and kind of what that means, like the symbolism and our pride that we have in it, because it kind of relates to the ark, in a way, because the ark's a symbol, and we have this reverence for the American flag. We don't want to let it touch the ground. We don't want to have anybody deface it or degrade it or anything like that. And there's actually, specific rules about how to care for the flag, when you raise it, when you lower it. Carter, you know all about that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's specific rules about, how to handle the flag. And we as Americans, red, white, and blue-blooded Americans, we have this sort of reverence and this awe for, not just the flag, but, what the flag represents. And Israel, regarding the ark was kind of the same way. They had this reverence, this awe, and it was a symbol of their nation, but it was more than just a symbol for their nation. It was a symbol for their, for God, actually. It was, ordained by God to be a symbol for His presence. And, so the people, they really loved this item, this thing. They cared for it, and they didn't want to have anything bad to it. We've already seen, like going through Samuel, that some bad things have happened to the ark, some bad things have happened because of the ark. But if you ask any American, it's like, will you let the flag touch the ground? No, absolutely not. We will jump in front of a moving bus to catch that flag before it hits the ground. We've been to ball games and stuff where we've seen the flag, and maybe they're carrying it. It's like getting close, we would jump out there and grab that thing if we could. And what we're going to find in chapter 6 here in 2 Samuel is a guy that kind of has that same kind of zeal. He sees the ark, he does something kind of impulsive, and it seems admirable at first when you first see, he's trying to save the reputation of the ark, he's trying to save the reputation of Israel, he's trying to uphold the reputation of God, but he dies. He instantly dies as soon as he touches this thing. So, at first glance we look at it and we think, oh, this is maybe, God being a bully, or it's harsh, or it's, it's a little overreaction on God's part. But if we look at, if we go through this and look at it, we're going to see kind of where the folly was, where the error was, and what happened here with this guy. So we just start verse 1, chapter 6. It says, David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all his men set out from Baalah of Judah, or I guess another word is Kirath Jearim is another name for that city. And he brought the ark up, he brought these men to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. So we got this ark, and what the ark of the covenant is, it's a box. It's just a box. It's basically a 3-foot 9-inch wide box by 2-foot 3-inch wide by 2-foot 3-inch tall box. And it's a wooden box. It's covered in gold. It has this ornate lid on it with the cherubim that are kind of angelic beings with wings that cover the seat. So if you can kind of picture that, that's maybe you've seen pictures of it, maybe you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie or whatever, but it's just a box. It had the stone tablets that God gave Moses. It has the budding rod that Aaron had. It had a golden jar of manna. And God provided all these things were encased in it, and the Israelites, when they were wandering through the desert, they had to carry it with them, and they moved it. When they finally reached the promised land, when they finally reached Canaan, they set it up in Gibeon, is where the tent, the tabernacle went up, and that's where the ark was. And, they got captured by the Philistines after the Israelites impulsively wanted to bring it out to battle. And So you have this whole kind of history that goes along with the ark, but now it's in Baalah, Judah, or Baalah of Judah, and that's the city where it was at, under the watch care of this guy named Abinadab. And him and his family are kind of the caretakers of the ark at this point. And we got David coming into his reign. He's the new king, and he's had some skirmishes between the northern kingdom of Israel and his own home kingdom of Judah. So we've got this, he's kind of got all those things kind of squashed and kind of quelled a little bit. So David's next step as king is to go get the ark and to bring it back to Jerusalem. He's built this new tent for it. The old tent, the original tent, still at Gibeon. He didn't take that down and move it. He just built a new one. So that's there in Jerusalem, the city of David, the traditional city of David. So we got David gathering up, this massive amount of people, 30,000 men to go and get this thing. So he's building it up. It's going to be a huge parade. He's got the musical instruments. He's got everything that he needs, to make this a grand ordeal. So he goes out there and get it. Now if we go on to I think we made it to verse 3. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzziah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding in a new cart. So right here, this is kind of where we sort of take a left turn. Like if you just look at this verse, you don't say, well, there's nothing wrong with this. But there were actually very, very explicit rules about how to handle the ark. And whether they were doing that right now, that was probably not. It had been in Abinadab's care for 20 years. That's how long it had been since it had done anything, been anywhere we heard anything about it. Saul called it out to battle one time during his reign, but other than that, we haven't heard much about it. But right here, we actually see that there's a huge violation of God's law with this, in the very beginning of this whole thing. So if you look back at, it's Numbers chapter 4, verse 15, this is where God is kind of telling the Levites about how to handle the ark and who's supposed to handle it and how they're specifically supposed to do it. Like on the bottom of the ark, they built these rings on it so they could slide poles into it so they could lift the ark and carry it with these poles. And the poles were covered in gold. That's how they were supposed to carry it. And only specific people of the tribe of Levi, and they were called the sons of Kohath. These were the group of people that were given authority to carry the ark, and they were supposed to carry it. But David goes up to this place and he's like, he kind of authorized this whole thing. And instead of consulting with God's plan for the ark, this is where he veers, and this is kind of where this whole story gets off course right from the very beginning. Because if you go like this whole story is repeated in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 13, and it's finished up in verse 15. So if you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verses 1 through 4, this is where we get David getting all these leaders together, all the priests, all the high-ranking guys in Israel, and he tells these guys, he says, well, I'm thinking about going to get the ark. What do you guys think? They're like, that sounds like a good idea, man. And he goes, well, what if we put it on a cart and drive it to Jerusalem? We're like, right on, we're right with you. So everybody in this whole plan, maybe it's just because David had a great amount of authority. Nobody said, hey, look here, bad idea, right? So nobody stood up and said that. Like, we've seen Nathan, the prophet, do this before. Maybe he left Nathan out because he knew Nathan would say, wait a minute. But he didn't consult with God. It doesn't even say that he consulted with God if he was even supposed to go get it. So once again, we see this greatly impulsive maneuver on behalf of David. And David is he's so much like us. He just does stuff. I'm going to go do that. And sometimes we just seen, he consulted with God before he went and fought the Philistines, and God said, yes, you can go fight them guys, but do it this certain way. So he did that, and it worked out for him. But every time we've seen David just jump off into something, it's always bad news. And this is just another one of those cases, because it doesn't say if he consulted with God first. No, he just consulted with all these leaders, and they said, yes, good idea. So he goes up to Abinadab and says, all right, we're going to put the ark on a cart. But he kind of modeled this, transportation method by the way the Philistines had done it. Because when they had the ark and they were getting all these bad things, the tumors and all that fun stuff that goes along with having the ark and you're not supposed to have it, they said, we got to get rid of it. So they put it on a cart. A new cart is how the word is described, new cart, or it's like a covered wagon or chariot or something like that, and they put it on there, 2 new cows, and just drove them out. That's how the Philistines do it. So I don't know why David says, hey, that's a good idea. But he did, and that's what they decided to do. So they get the cart, they load it up, put it on there, and they have this huge parade, and then they start the parade. And we go to... And so verse 4 says, with the ark of God on it, and Ahio, who was walking in front of us, so this guy Ahio with an A, that name just means little brother. I don't know if that was his name or just that's what they called him. Uzzah's little brother. So he's walking in front of the cart, kind of clearing the path, all the guys of 30,000 men out there in the street cheering. He's like, move out of the way, make way for the cart, make way for the ark. And then we got Uzzah, the other brother, the older brother. He's actually guiding the cart, driving it. I don't know if he's walking beside her, if he's actually riding in the seat or whatever. It doesn't say. It's not that specific. But what happens, as they're going along, the procession is going along, and everybody's singing and dancing. David's carrying on with his lutes and lyres, and he's just having a grand old time. So when we get to verse 5, it says, David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. So they're really getting into this with songs and with harps and lyres and tambourines and sistrums and cymbals. And so they're just really carrying on, making a big, big thing. And I read some commentaries that say that, this was during like David did this deliberately during a festival time, one of the 3 big festivals it doesn't say specifically, but that's what some of the commentators speculate, and it makes a lot of sense. So you got everybody kind of riled up anyway because it's a festival. Now you're moving the ark, and it's the most important thing in Israel, and Israel's reunited, and there's a whole lot of great things kind of going along with this, but they're still not doing it right. Their great intentions are still doesn't negate the fact that what they're doing is incredibly wrong, and we're about to find out that they've messed up. So we get to verse 6, and what we're kind of what the passage is telling us when we read through this is the complacency of the folly of our own complacency and how that affects us. So if we look at how he first handled that, with consulting people, complacency actually leads to consulting our friends and our colleagues and our peers instead of going to the word of truth, and that's the Bible. That's the bottom line. If we consult our friends and they're good, godly people, that's not necessarily a bad idea in and of itself until they tell us to do something that's contradictory to what God's word says. And that's when, the flag should go up and we should say, wait, I appreciate your advice, but, Scripture says something else. And we find ourselves, we do this pretty consistently. It's human nature to get complacent, to become, to start trimming the corners a little bit here and there and saying, well, maybe that's not as important as it used to be. Maybe God's word doesn't mean exactly what it does today as it did when it was written. And we start to alter our behaviors, and we start to modify, and eventually, you kind of start steering that way, and you get off into these huge errors. You find yourself way off in left field, and this is kind of what we got going on here, is this thing just kind of drifting off. It drifts off way in a hurry, not like in our cases, where it kind of drifts off a little bit slow, and we don't have these really immediate results. But we do see these kind of, these kind of things when we consult men instead of consulting God. And we see this same kind of scenario played out in Exodus when Moses, when he actually, because he's in the desert wandering with the people after he's freed them from Egypt, and they're kind of doing their thing out in Egypt or out in the wilderness, and they're thirsty and they're starving, they're all complaining, and so he goes to God and says, what are we going to do about these people complaining about starving and dying of thirst? And God says, well, strike this rock and water will gush out and you can drink. So Moses takes his staff and he smacks the rock and out comes the water. And then that happened actually in Exodus chapter 17, and it's kind of accounted in verses 5 through 7. If you go through, like in Numbers, the same scenario, it seems like the same story, but it's a different time, it's later. It's Numbers 20, chapter 20, verse 8. And the people are bickering again, they're complaining, oh, I'm thirsty, we're dying, we got to go back to it. So they got this huge congregation of people. Moses is listening to them, and they're kind of carrying on about what they're going to do about their water situation. So he goes to God, God tells him, speak to the rock, and you'll get the water. But instead of speaking to the rock, instead of listening to God, he let the people influence him, and he strikes the rock again. And this is actually why Moses didn't make it to the promised land. I don't know if you realize that or not, but that was his folly, his complacency, where he listened to man instead of to God. I mean, he listened to God the first time and he just kind of repeated that, but just because God says one thing one time doesn't mean he can't change his mind and do something different another time. So we get the same sort of action where a leader is consulting his people and they give him bad advice and he listens to them. And ultimately, it cost Moses his life. He ended up dying in the desert. He didn't get to go to Canaan, and he didn't see the promised land. So there are consequences for being complacent, for this lackadaisical attitude that we can get sometimes. But if we go back to 2 Samuel here, if we go to chapter 6, this is the thunder. You see, we get when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, which in the account in First Chronicles, it actually calls the city Shicon. And Nacon is a word that means prepared. So it's kind of ironic that they come to this man named Prepared. And Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. So the oxen are walking and he hit a chug hole or a rut or something, and the wagon teeters, and Uzzah being the closest one to it, I don't know if he wanted to be the hero, like we were talking about with the flag, like he just wanted to be, reserve that image or what he wanted to do, but there was this impulse where he grabs the ark to keep it from falling off or to keep it from sliding or moving. But, so he touches the ark, and here's what happens. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Like, Uzzah reaches up, touches the ark, and 30,000 people are celebrating, like going like crazy, and this guy is instantly dead. The party stops. Okay, so we learn from Uzzah's grave mistake that his complacency led to ignoring God. Because God said back in Numbers 4:15, when he was commanding the Levites how to carry it with poles and all that, he said, do not touch it or you will die that day. It's like the second time in the Bible that God gave a very strict, disobey your dead command. He did it back in Genesis when in the Garden of Eden, he said, do not eat of this fruit or you will die this very day. And we see that played out. We see, Adam and Eve in the garden, and then the temptation and the folly of their complacency where they eat the fruit and they die. And you can look at that verse and say, well, wait a minute, they didn't die that day. They lived like, I think Exodus says that, or not Exodus, but Genesis chapter 5, I think is what it is. But anyway, it says that Adam lived 930 years. I mean, so we got to look at that and say, well, what happened there? God made a promise, and the thing when God makes a promise, God has to keep his promise, or he's infallible, or he's fallible if he doesn't keep his promises. So when he says, touch the ark, and he died, it seems like a harsh thing, but when Uzzah touched it, he had to kill Uzzah, because that's what God promised that he was going to do. if God doesn't uphold his promises, then we've got no truth. We've got no foundation to stand on. So, God can be like, 1 minute, yeah, I'm going to kill you for this, and then you do, and he's like, never mind, I don't really mean I'm going to kill you, I'm just kidding. That's no kind of God at all. I mean, that's a false God, and our God is a God of truth. He's a God of foundation, and we know his truth by his word. And we don't consult his word, we find ourselves in error, and we find ourselves on the consequences of his promises. So, in Genesis, when they ate the fruit, they ate, and it says, well, God said you will die this day, but it doesn't seem like they died that day. I mean, some people say they died spiritually and caused the death of everybody else, but really, if you look at, there's a couple of different places in Scripture where you see, like in Psalms 90 verses 4, and then again in the New Testament where he kind of repeats it in 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 8, where I know you're all familiar with this, where God says 1,000 years, or 1 day is like 1,000 years to God. So if you think about that, you got 1 day equals 1,000 years. Adam lived 930 years. He didn't make it 1 day according to God's calendar. So God upheld his promises. And you can't say, well, God's fallible, God's a liar. No, God upholds his promises. God does what God says he's going to do. And when God says that there's one way to get to heaven, and it's through Jesus Christ, his Son, that's exactly what it is. We can't deviate from that at all. But, if we get back here to 2 Samuel, we see that Uzzah died, the parade stops, and David was angry. We get to verse 8, it says, David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. And to this day, that place is called Perez Uzzah, which Perez Uzzah is a word that means, or Perez is a kind of a word that means place of slaughter. So it can mean breach. So you have breach of Uzzah, or smiting of Uzzah. And Uzzah is a word that means strength. So here we have the ark being kind of led by this guy whose name is Strength, and maybe that's kind of a reflection of his error, because maybe he was trying to do it on his own, or maybe it was a representation of David's strength, since he was kind of orchestrating this whole thing. But when David saw this and this man's dead, David, he blamed the Lord and became angry at the Lord. And you can just imagine kind of what's going through David's head. Like, why would you do this, God? What's going on? We weren't doing anything wrong. But kind of what we got going on here is, as David, I think he's feeling this self-condemnation, because he probably realizes that this is all his fault. I mean, he orchestrated this whole thing. He set this whole plan into motion. Now, I don't know if Uzzah and his brother and Abinadab, I don't know if that whole family, I don't know if they were Levites, it doesn't say. So were they supposed to be caring for the ark? We don't know. We know they were, but we don't know if they were supposed to be. And it's not like David didn't know the law, because when we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, when this story kind of plays out and we get to the conclusion, David, he's by the book when it comes to moving the ark the second time, because when this time it stops, Uzzah's dead, they kind of back up and say, oh, I don't want to have anything else to do with this, right? So when David's kind of kicking himself and hating God all at the same time, which I think we find ourselves doing. We see, some kind of the folly of our own actions, and we blame God. It's really our own fault. We didn't do what we were supposed to be doing, and we say, well, why'd you let this happen, God? Well, why did we do what we were doing wrong in the first place to get to that point, right? So David's having this kind of this pity party, and he's like, I don't want to have nothing to do with the ark. And so he moves it to this, this guy named Obed-Edom. He moves it to his house, and Obed's like, all right, bring on the ark. And, everybody else is probably like, but Obed's like, come on, yeah. But Obed, he was actually a Levite. It talks about his lineage and his, his role as a Levite later on. So he had every right to be in charge of the ark. So he was like, I got no problem with it. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So bring it here and leave it, whatever you need to do. And God blessed Obed-Edom because of this. It says, if we go to verse 9, it says, David was afraid of the Lord, which I was talking about that day, and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? And I look at that phrase. I mean, we can tell kind of how self-centered David's motivation was when he says, how am I supposed to bring it home? How am I supposed to do this? You're killing everybody, God. You're just killing everybody. How am I supposed to bring it back to my house? Yeah, so you can tell, like, David was a little self-centered. He had a little self-focus going on there, and you could tell the folly of his complacency and his own self-centeredness there with his own declaration of how am I supposed to bring that back to me? He wasn't bringing it back for the Lord. He wasn't, bringing it back for the glory of God. He was bringing it back to glorify himself. And ultimately, all these things, you see them how they add up, and it's just one left turn, one left turn, one left turn. And, they say, 2 rights don't make a wrong, but 3 lefts make a right? No, I don't know. So Uzzah's dead, David's terrified, and we got to get rid of the ark. Something's going on. So he was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. So he's like, I don't want to have anything else to do with it. He just changed his mind all of a sudden. Parade's over, party's over. So he took it, instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, and the Gittite, something like that, Gittite, which is basically, he's from Gath. He lives in the city of Gath, and Gath was one of the cities given to the Levites by God when they got their inheritance. It's one of their pastured cities. So in chapter 11, it says, the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months. So it stayed there in his house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So once again, we see the folly of complacency in David's behalf, and then, the reward of obedience through Obed-Edom. And so he gets the blessings, and we'll learn a little bit with David, or Scott picked this up next week with chapter 12, so we're just going to kind of stay focused on what happened right here for the time being. So you get the blessings from Obed-Edom, you get the curses for David and Uzzah. But I was thinking, this is in the week when Jesus entered into Jerusalem in the New Testament. This is the beginning of the Passover week and Palm Sunday. And, so this is not the first time in the Bible's history where we see a group of people gathered up together to celebrate the entrance of something, so they're together for the entrance of the ark in here, and it kind of reflects the Passion Week, and where Jesus entered Jerusalem. They were all celebrating, they were all having their little parade, and they were focused kind of on their own selves, kind of in the same situation. And it's not the first time that God struck somebody dead because of their sin. I mean, in this case it was Uzzah, and in the New Testament we get Jesus, kind of being struck down not for his own sin, but for all of our sin. And you see the complacency of the people, and they wanted this king, and they wanted, the nation of Israel to be redeemed from Rome, and so they're celebrating under these false pretenses, and they're not doing it according to what God's prescription is. Jesus is obviously the Messiah, they have a reason to celebrate, but kind of the motivation behind their celebration is a little skewed, and you can see, how God reacts to that, and, by the end of the week, they're not celebrating anymore. They're saying, crucify Jesus. So, and then, God struck him dead because of our sin, and he bore our sin. And the ark is sort of a picture of Christ, and the presence of God that is represented by the Ark of the Covenant. It has to be dealt with with reverence, with awe, with understanding. And if we find ourselves being complacent, if we find ourselves out of sync with God's Word, we find ourselves not consulting with God, we find ourselves ignoring God's Word, if we find ourselves, failing because of, failing because of our complacency, then we need to take a look at kind of where we're going wrong, consult the Bible, and say, well, how do I get back on track? How do I fix this thing? So it's something that we definitely need to do, and I'm going to invite all of you guys to kind of, examine yourselves. Like Romans 12:2 says, don't be conformed to this world, which they were kind of conformed to this world. They conformed to the way the Philistines moved the ark. They said, well, let's move with an oxen and cart instead of doing it with the priests like we're supposed to. So that they conform themselves to the world, but the word says, don't be conformed to this world. It's restricted. It's a law to not do that. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And you renew your mind by your reverence to the Word, you study the Word, and that's how you kind of get back on track.